charge? Good.
Yeah.
I like being in charge, but you're the conductor. You like being in charge too. Come on. I mean.
Well, good afternoon, everybody. I have to take responsibility for this. Dan pointed out just a few hours ago that the booklet says 4 p.m. And actually, this event was moved several times. It was supposed to have been tomorrow, so I'm going to be here tomorrow too, just in case somebody saw that somewhere and wrote it down and didn't check back. But it is an interesting business, I have found, as an artist and musician, organizing things. I'd say the most interesting thing that I've learned is how difficult it is when you make a request to someone and they say, okay, fine, and then you don't hear from them again for weeks at a time. And I think conductors usually have somebody else who kind of, makes sure things happen. And now in this particular role, I'm the one who has to make sure it happens. Dan did his part, and somewhere between the festival, the school, and the printer, something got through on this little booklet. First of all, we do have these booklets out, and if you don't have one, you can grab one out by the front door. They are accurate from here on. Everything else seems to be accurate.
Or so he thinks.
And so we thought that we would just get started, and I'll ask Dan and Matthew to talk just a little bit about, and I've got a few stories that I promise nobody else will hear between now and the time Jamie gets here. And then we can also start diving in on talking a little bit about tonight too, because that's going to be very interesting, I think. Yeah. Dan, why don't you?
I'll be happy to. Thanks so much. Can everybody hear pretty well? Good. So the way I think you might want to think about this, particularly for those of you who are here right now, which is all of you, and if you then go to the JCC tonight, I'm thinking of this as today we're going to be talking to Jamie a little bit about Lenny as the composer, conductor, and father. That's really the three things that I think Jamie can, and family person, what that means, how he did all of those things together. Tonight at 7 o'clock, it's going to be more about Lenny the Jew. And I can say it that way, I suppose, without it sounding anti-Semitic. I don't think it's anti-Semitic anyway. It's just that's going to be what we'll be dealing with, is what did it mean for him to be Jewish in America and being America's foremost conductor or foremost musician and composer, although at that point he wasn't that. He was simply a guy trying to write the music that he wanted to write, that he felt he needed to write. Conducting, that's another matter. George will tell us what that all meant, I think, better than I can or Matt. Matt is the scholar of Bernstein. He knows the ins and outs probably better than George and I and 300 people all put together. So he's going to be able to tell us from the musicological perspective who this guy was. George is a wonderful pianist and a wonderful conductor, and knows Bernstein through those lenses, I think, most, right?
Yeah.
And your interactions with him in that regard. I know him from having witnessed him and been around him at Tanglewood when I was a composition fellow there in 1979, I think, and through his music. So I'm coming at him from, who was this guy as a composer? So I think those are the way we're going to be looking at these discussions. So when Jamie gets here, we'll, I think, be posing a lot of questions to her and be in discussion. I mean, this is really a discussion. I was going to save my punchlines, but I can't, so you're going to get the punch. It's sort of going to be like we're Mr. Rogers' neighborhood. Mr. Rogers?
Yeah.
Yeah, Mr. Rogers. Yeah, I even wore my sweater. I just want you to know. Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood and Bill Buckley's Firing Line. Right? It's a combination of those two. And maybe Dick Cavett, since...
You realize that anybody under the age of 55
doesn't get that.
Get any of this.
Doesn't get that. Do you get that?
Well, I'm a historian, so...
He's a historian, so he gets it. Okay. So...
Well, I got to start with the story.
I
don't know if I can really tell. I don't know if I can. Well,
homiletics are good.
I won't say anything about it. Maybe after Jamie comes. I was a conducting fellow at Tanglewood, and Mr. Bernstein was assigned to coach me with a composition fellow. Probably a name which I'm not going to mention, but you would recognize.
Probably.
And we were seated in a place like this with people seated out there, and it was Mr. Bernstein, myself, and this composer. And the composer had written something, this huge score, and it was one of these pieces where musicians were being asked to strike the key, strike the
fingerboard.
Yeah, use their bows to hit the strings above the bridge and below the bridge, and bang on their instruments and do that in all these patterns. And the piece was pretty much all like that.
All, really?
Almost. And
Okay.
and then Mr. Bernstein just kept turning the page, and he started shaking his head, and he just said, at some point, I really feel badly for this guy, because there were people in the audience, and he said, I will characterize it with euphemistically.
Yeah, euphemistically.
He looked at him and he said, Jiminy Christmas, can't you guys write any freaking melodies? And it was this whole thing that I know that Jamie's going to want to talk about too as well, but this academic world that this composer was coming from wasn't connecting with the melodic Bernstein. And some of the things that Jamie said in our discussion about the Kaddish was this real juxtaposition of tonality with atonality, and finally he gives us the tonal moments at points just when it can relieve us from the stress, really, of the atonality.
Fair enough. That was what year, just so I know?
Me, I was there in 1983.
83.
Yeah, I was 11.
A semantic issue, just so we know. Should we be calling him Mr. Bernstein? Or do you call him Lenny?
Well,
or?
I wrote a little piece that's on our website that
Yeah.
said, we never called him Lenny. I think that's the name of it's like the title of the piece.
Right.
And there were 3 ways you referred to him. To his face, it was Mr. Bernstein, and or Maestro. And the way that we referred to him, for example, if some conducting fellows, musicians at Tanglewood, would say, well, where's how would he want it? Well, we would call him LB. Yeah, and never Lenny. There was one time he was at a room probably a little bit smaller than this, and he was answering questions, and it was kind of like a press conference. And somebody in the back raised his hand, and he said, say, Lenny, I was wondering if you, and he looked at the guy and said, do I know you? And the guy looked at him, and Mr. Bernstein kind of looked, squinted his eyes, and then he said, second trombone, Boston Symphony. I conducted you in 6 years ago. And the guy said, yes, that's it. And he had that kind of a memory for faces, for voices, and names. He actually remembered names.
He did.
Yeah.
Okay, should we refer to him as Mr. Bernstein then in the course of this?
I think so.
You
I
think
think so, yeah.
Okay, then I'm happy to do it as Mr. Bernstein. What I remember most, though, I'll be curious to know what your impressions, having worked with him so closely. What George is referring to is that Mr. Bernstein would have open sessions at Tanglewood, coaching sessions for conductors. He did not work with the composers when he was there, the year that I was there. And what George has stated is quite accurate, that at those times, melody was something not to be countenanced generally, unless you were David Del Tredici and had discovered the Alice series, and were already writing Final Alice. But he took a huge gamble. This is the late 70s into the early 80s. As he said when he wrote that piece, a piece that you would love to hear, by the way, Final Alice, it's a wonderful one. He won the Pulitzer Prize for it. He said, he wrote the piece and expecting to put in lots of wrong notes, and he never did. He just never quite got around to doing it because he didn't want to. So it was an interesting time, but Mr. Bernstein would conduct sessions with the conducting fellows. and they were open to anyone. So I spent a lot of my time when he was there in his sessions. And the one thing I will never forget, and I wonder if you will remember this also, is simply his voice.
Oh, yeah.
He had a very deep bass voice. It wasn't the greatest voice, but he was an absolutely, obviously, marvelously expressive, and he would just open up at any point, didn't matter what was right or spirit, and he'd go, no, 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 it goes, come on, you got to get him to do that. What's your problem here? So you think of him as this guy who's up in the clouds. He wasn't up in the clouds. He was right down there with the composer, with the musician, trying to get them to say, look, this is the music. What's the intent of the music? You know, yes, of course, we want you to play a tune. I mean, he was meticulous about everything. But he was never at a loss for making sure that the music and the intent and the emotional quality of the music was what he was after. And I remember conductor students who must have been panicked. And I mean, can you imagine being in front of this maestro and trying to conduct a piece that you probably knew forever? Now, I have one question also for you, George. His memory, you mentioned that. He must have memorized how many pieces, and how many pieces did he retain at any time?
Well, the most famous moment in his career was November 14th, 1943, which was when he jumped in for Bruno Walter. Sunday, it was a matinee. You might remember what time it was, Matt. Was it 3 p.m. or 11 a.m.?
I know he was out late the night before, but I don't remember.
Correct.
It was always
Yeah,
that.
that's the night before was the New York premiere of I Hate Music. It had already been premiered somewhere else. Can't remember where, Boston or something. And he was celebrating and was, shall we say, deep in his cup. And it was very late. And as he tells the story, somebody comes to him and says, you're probably going to have to jump in for the matinee. And I think I saw a clipping that said it was 3 p.m. The story was better when it was 11 a.m. But it was broadcast nationally, so they probably would want it a little later. And they said he would have to jump in. And he did the entire performance without a score. He says he doesn't remember it because he says he was still a little tipsy. And it was Don Quixote, Richard Strauss. I mean, it was big pieces. Very complicated, and he had no score. Now, most of the time that I knew him, he was using a score most of the time. I seldom saw him, other than standard repertoire, I mean, even Mahler symphonies and so forth, which he certainly had memorized as a younger man. Those things were memorized, but then perhaps just, you know, you lose, it's a funny, it's an awkward thing, this whole conducting from memory. I got in the habit of doing it as a young conductor, and I recall when a very interesting learning experience. I had a soloist really freak out on me. It was the Tchaikovsky Violin Concerto, which I'd done. You know, I didn't
Lots of times.
but he was he just really got nervous because I had no score. And Yoel Levy, who was music director of Atlanta, did everything from memory. And there was a violinist, Shlomo Mintz, came to play Bartok. And he said, damn it, Yoel, he probablyid in Hebrew, you're taking a score out there. And he did. So I stopped any way of even considering conducting with a soloist without a score myself. But it's the whole business of conducting without a score is interesting because I always viewed it as a kind of a moving chart. If it takes you 10% of your concentration to remember what's coming next, it's probably a good idea. If it takes 50 or 75% of your concentration trying to remember what comes next, then it's probably a bad idea. I've done Rite of Spring. I've done pieces with many, sometimes hundreds of meter changes, and I find it very difficult sometimes to do that while you're looking at the score. But it's really a matter of personal preference, and he kind of gave up on that after a certain period.
Gave up of not using a score.
Correct. He just started using a
part
score.
of his career, he was mostly using a score.
Most of the time that I remember him, he was using a score. Yeah.
Not with Beethoven symphonies, but with other things that he might have done less.
Correct.
Often.
I met him in 1982, and the series had just come out about Beethoven. It was called Bernstein Beethoven.
Right.
PBS. Interesting choice of order.
Right.
It was all on film, and he did it. He did, of course, all the Beethoven symphonies plus a number of overtures were on that series of broadcasts. I don't know if it was not 9 broadcasts. I think it was condensed into like 6 or 7.
Mm-hmm.
And he did every one of those without a score. But that of course is a slightly different matter than, say, The Rite of Spring as an example.
Right.
It's interesting to hear this. I'm teaching a seminar on Bernstein this semester, and one of the first things my students did was watch the video from, I think it was 1984, of West Side Story, the operatic, with the operatic performers, and it's the recording session. And one of the first things Bernstein says as he gets together with the singers, this is the first time I've really studied this score. The last few weeks I've been studying the score and really getting to know it. And by that time the piece was almost 30 years old. But for him to see him engaged in study of that sort, which of course he knew well, but had been part of America's consciousness for so long, was really fascinating. And to see him and see what he reacted to when if something would be off. We noticed that rhythm was the most important thing. Above diction or even articulation, it was all about rhythm. He was really fixating on does this come off rhythmically.
And as a matter of fact, in that recording, it didn't always.
Mm-hmm. Right.
That was a rather embarrassing stretch of difficulty with a very famous operatic singer who had certainly never sung the part, and it was also the reverse ethnicity quandary. I mean, what happens if you switch around the Latin ethnicity versus which side of the drama you're on, and that caused some issues. I remember, one or two of you might have heard me tell this story before, but there was and just to update everybody here, we got started a little early because there was one spot where we didn't quite catch it, where it said we were going to start at 4.
Whenever she's ready.
And in actuality, we're going to start at 4:30. So,
well,
is she here?
She's here.
Okay,
she's
great.
here. Yeah, another thing to remember is that what this is highlighting also is the difference between writing a piece and then conducting a piece. So we're talking about Bernstein, both the composer and the conductor, and it's a very different task and a very different way of thinking. When Bernstein is writing music as a composer, he's working on every note, getting every other note, the next note out, so to speak. I mean, there's no other way to describe it other than that, but every note follows the previous one. Now, you may have ideas about sections and things that you're going to repeat or ways that you might be varying them. But nonetheless, here's the guy sitting writing a note and then another note and then another note. And then 30 years later, as the conductor, he's coming and saying, who was this guy who wrote this piece of music? I mean, he had to be thinking that. I mean, as a composer, I know, at least I have a sense that that's what he was thinking. What was I thinking? What did I want? God, what would I do now also? I'm sure had to
Well, here's
been,
something
going through his mind. Go
something
ahead.
you
What
couldn't
was he
do.
thinking?
Something you couldn't do today.
Yeah.
The story of West Side Story is, and I'll put it in context of a letter he wrote to some potential producer friends of his in the late 40s. He said, I've got a great idea for a musical. It's the story of Romeo and Juliet, but instead of the Montagues and the Capulets, it's going to be set in New York City, and it's going to be Jews against Catholics. And they said, oh gosh, Lenny, that might be too controversial. I'll tell you what, instead of religious, let's make it racial. And you think to Marana High School, who's going to be singing tonight the Chichester Psalms, I heard them at their school at a presentation almost a week ago now, Tuesday. And they did Chichester, but they also did some excerpts from West Side Story where they did the whole series, they did the entire version of America. You know, I like the city of San Juan. I know a boat you can get on. Everyone there will give big cheer. And the other one sings, everyone there will have moved here. And you think you couldn't write that today. I mean, can you imagine? Anyway, there she is.
Here she is. Here's Jamie Bernstein. Come and have a seat, Jamie.
Hi.
Matt Mugmon.
Nice to meet you.
We have met
Professor.
Professor Dan
Nice
Asia.
to see you.
Maestro.
Nice to see you again.
Hello. It was
Don't
supposed to be
No, it was
4:30, right?
You had all the right
You
times.
had
Don't
everything
worry.
right.
Don't worry.
It was an oversight. We got one booklet that got it printed wrong, and it snuck through.
Oops.
So,
Well, hello, you've all been very patient and everything, but I'm sure the conversation has been scintillating.
So to bring you right up to speed, as I've described to them, today is somewhere between being in Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood and Bill Buckley's Firing Line, or the Dick Cavett Show. And
Do they know those references?
No, they don't. They have no idea what I'm talking about. So a few people do, but a lot of people don't.
Yeah, that's
And George, if you want to pull around a little bit so that
yeah.
that'll be perfect. So we've just talked a little bit about how we're going to talk about this. So George has said it's Mr. Bernstein. That's going to be tough for
It
you.
was to me.
To you, it's going to be Dad. I assume.
well, yeah, my dad.
Okay. So however you wish to approach this, we're all taking our best whack at how to make this work.
Okay.
And today I suggested we're talking about Leonard Bernstein, the composer, conductor, and family, husband, father, etc. Tonight we're talking about Lenny and the Jewish aspect of who he was as a Jew. So I thought we would bifurcate that a little bit, at least for today, since the hope is that a lot of these people will come to both. We also have a bunch of young composers here.
Which
So-
of you are the young composer?
Yeah, raise your hands. Let me rephrase. We have a bunch of very enterprising composers here. Young and middle-aged. Who will, we might want to open this up at some point for questions. But let me introduce you first, since now that you're here, if that's okay.
Sure.
So Jamie Bernstein is a narrator, writer, and broadcaster who has transformed a lifetime of loving music into a career of sharing her knowledge and excitement with others. I didn't write this, by the way. Leonard Bernstein, together with her mother, the pianist and actress Felicia, and help me with the
Monte Alegre.
Monte Alegre, created a spontaneous, ebullient household, which I hope you will tell us more about, that turned Jamie into a lifelong cultural enthusiast. In addition to the Bernstein Beat, a family concert about her father, modeled after his own groundbreaking young people's concerts, Jamie has also written and narrated concerts about Mozart and Aaron Copland, among others. She travels the world as a concert narrator, appearing everywhere from Beijing to Caracas
To Tucson.
to Vancouver, and I was going to add that, you bet, to Tucson. You may decide you want to come back, you never know also. In addition to her own scripted narrations, Jamie also performs standard concert narrations such as Walton's Facade, Copland's A Lincoln Portrait, and her father's Symphony No. 3, which hopefully you all heard this weekend, Kaddish. She's a frequent speaker on musical topics, including in-depth discussions of her father's works. She has done numerous things also for radio, including the BBC and for New York's WQXR. She is the devoted mother of 2 children, Francisca and Evan. She likes to play Scrabble, and she's a tennis player, and she makes an annual pilgrimage to the Utah desert to recharge her spiritual battery. So now let's officially welcome Jamie Bernstein. Okay, now it's official. It's official. thought I'd start off with a question, and then my co-panelists here will ask Jamie questions. Jamie and I talked briefly before. She said, I can talk if you really want me to just by myself. And I said, no, it's okay. Let's do questions and answers, because quite frankly, I think it's more fun.
It's way more fun.
Okay, it's more fun. So, your dad was a composer, a conductor, an educator, obviously musician, a cultural ambassador, a humanitarian, a husband, and a father. That's a lot of stuff.
Yeah. When did he sleep?
Exactly. So my question to you is a complicated one. I'm going to start off with a tough one. So he was busy all the time. You were his daughter. What was it like being Mr. Bernstein's daughter? I mean, how did this work? Was it a joy? Was it a mixture? Was he there? Did you see him sometimes? Did you see him every other month, every other week, at 4 in the morning, at 2 in the afternoon? How did it work? I mean, I don't know when he slept. I don't think he slept much. So tell us how this worked.
Well, he did not sleep much. He was a terrible insomniac. So he basically squeezed 2 lives into one because he skipped the sleeping part. It's amazing how much more you can get done when you just don't ever get to sleep. People ask me all the time, what was it like to grow up in that environment? And people ask me so many times that I've written a book.
Right.
So you can get the long answer when my book comes out in June. But the short answer here today is that it was an incredibly stimulating and warm and pretty happy household that I grew up in. My mother was from South America, from Chile, so it was a bilingual household. That was my lucky break, one of many, to grow up effortlessly bilingual. I just learned 2 languages as a little kid. So that was wonderful. And it's true that my dad was often away. He would go on tour somewhere and be gone for as long as a month at a time. But then when he came back, it was like, Daddy, 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 Daddy. And there would be presents and attention, and it was all very exciting. And then if he was around, he was really around the house because he didn't have a 9-to-5 job. So maybe he would have a 10 a.m. rehearsal or something, but then he'd be around in the afternoon when we got home from school, or he'd be around in the evenings, and we had this gigantic circle of friends and family, and there were always people in the house. The house was just full of people all the time. Chairs were always being dragged up to the dining room table. We had this wonderful Chilean cook named Rosalia, who made our lives very happy indeed. So, there were all these people, and all this laughter and teasing and word games and lots of music. And my brother and I, before my sister was born, my brother and I shared a bedroom, and we would go to sleep hearing the grown-ups carrying on downstairs. We could hear them laughing and singing around the piano and carrying on. That was sort of the lullaby to go to sleep
Who
by.
would be coming to visit in the early years of your life? We're talking about from, let's say, 57, 58, 59, into the early 60s. I mean, I was just astonished, I have to also admit, to realize that your father's career started so young. I mean, by the time you guys were born, he was in the middle of lots of stuff. So who was in the house? Who was around? Who'd come to visit?
He loved his work so much that work and play really were the same thing. He was just one of those lucky people whose work was also his play. And so, in general, the people he collaborated with were also his friends. So Betty Comden and Adolph Green, who wrote the book and lyrics to On the Town, my father's first Broadway musical, and then the next one, Wonderful Town, which they all wrote together as well. And then there was later on when we got into the Candide West Side Story patch, Lillian Hellman was around all the time. She wrote the original book to Candide. And then Steve Sondheim, who joined the collaborative team for West Side Story. He was the kid who was brought in a ways into the work. And Jerry Robbins and Arthur Lawrence, they were around a lot too.
Yeah.
And then, I didn't know who they were except for they were just friends of the family. Only way later did I discover that my parents' friends were so illustrious. There were lots of them,
Did some of the writing take place in your home? I mean, did they come over and they were working in the
A lot,
den or in the
yeah.
kitchen or wherever?
Yeah, because my dad had a very nice and relatively spacious studio off the front hall.
Where was this? Where in
This
New York?
was back, the first apartment that we all lived in as a family was in a building called the Osborne, which is just diagonal from Carnegie Hall. So it was a very nice commute for my dad.
Right.
Didn't have to travel too far. And it was a really cool, funky old building. And our apartment was just big enough for us. And then when my sister was coming along, then we had to move somewhere else. But those were the early years, past, right up to and past West Side Story.
Right.
We were still in that apartment.
What composers were hanging out with your dad?
Composers, well.
Sorry, I gotta ask that. I'm the composer here. So.
It's okay.
Yeah.
That's what we're here to do today. Well, the first one that I remember meeting was Samuel Barber. Now, Samuel Barber, I gather, has the reputation of having been kind of severe and stern and serious.
Not in your house.
Well, we met him in the summer. We were up in our little, summer rental on the island of Martha's Vineyard. And he came for dinner. And he walked in, and when he was introduced to my brother and me, he said, "Pleased to meet you. I'm Sam the Garbage Man." So we were enchanted already. But then he played this game with us where he would stand over us and start wagging his finger in a circle closer and closer. And he would say this little poem. Ailey, maily, tippity, taily, aki, baki, sody, cracky, skook! And he would poke us in the belly button. Again, do it again. We made Sam the Garbage Man do that about 1,000,000 times. And we thought he was the funniest, coolest grown-up we'd ever met. But I don't think other grown-ups had that impression of Samuel Barber.
How was Aaron Copland how did he interact within the family?
Yeah, Aaron Copland was also very much a part of our lives. We didn't see him all the time, but when he came over, it was clear that my dad just adored him and my mother did too. And there was just such warmth. And Aaron Copland is another one of those composers that you would think was very sort of stern and severe, and he really wasn't. When you met him, he had this goofy giggle, and these buck teeth, and this beaky nose, and his glasses, and so he looked like a cartoon character. He was very disarming for a child. We loved him.
Did you see him in summers, or up at your place, or up at
Yeah,
Tanglewood?
sometimes in the summer, and he didn't come over that often. He didn't live in New York City. He lived upstate. So he wasn't just around. He wouldn't just like pop in the way Betty and Adolph might,
I gotta ask about one other person. What about Lucas Foss?
Oh, and he was also a very close family friend. And our families were very close all down the line. We're still very close to those kids.
You are?
Yeah, Christopher and Eliza are still close to the Bernsteins. And we loved Lucas and Cornelia, his wife. They were terrific. And Lucas too was a person with, I don't think actually that my parents had very much time for anybody who didn't have a sense of humor.
Right.
They were not interested in being sober and serious all the time. They liked to have a laugh, and so Lucas also had this terrific wit. He was fun. So he was around too.
When did your dad actually write music? Was it in the evening when everybody went to sleep?
Yeah, when
That's
everybody
when
else
everything-
was asleep, like, starting around maybe 2 a.m., those would be his golden hours, when the rest of the world was asleep.
Jamie, you started a talk about how he had trouble composing while he was conducting and vice versa. and he kind of separated the two. Could you develop that?
Yeah.
a little?
Well, as I explained before the concert the other night, it was as if my father had two personalities living in the same body. And one of those personalities was the really outgoing one, the one that loved people and loved to communicate and loved connectedness and loved to share knowledge, and that was the kind of public Lenny, and the one that people would see on the podium, and the one that dealt with orchestras and drew those performances out of the players and went on tour and went out to the parties and stayed up all night carousing. Okay, so that was one Lenny. And then the other Lenny was the composer who had to, close the door in his studio and be all alone and, find those notes and put them on a blank page. And it was really like two different engines. So when the public engine was really going in high gear, and then he would come off the road and come home and have 6 weeks in which to just compose, it would take him a really long time to cool down engine number 1 and rev up engine number 2, because they were really at cross purposes. So just around the time he'd get some momentum going in engine number 2 with the composing, oh gee, it was time to go back on the road. And that was how he ping-ponged back and forth for really his whole adult working life.
Yeah. Could I ask you a little bit about that and the compatibility of those engines? Because one of the things that I'm fascinated about is reading how different people would push him in different directions, or tell him you need to spend more time, you need to pick a specialization, decide that you're going to be a composer or of this particular kind of music, or just decide that you're going to be a conductor and focus on that. And I'm curious about your take on that push that others have tried to give to him to focus on
Right.
one or the other.
I guess he was sort of a stubborn guy in the end, and he was just going to do things his way. And he knew that a lot of the time that was going to either get him in trouble or cause him to lose respect from certain departments of, academic musical thinking or whatever, it got him in trouble. And he also knew that having so many different things to do meant that he was shaving off the time and attention that he had for any one of them. And he knew that was the
Trade-off.
the trade-off. That was the downside of the trade-off. The upside of the trade-off was that he got an awful lot of stuff done and managed to leave us with so many different kinds of works and conducting recordings and videos. I mean, he left just a gigantic body of work. So who is to say whether it was a good or a bad thing that he spread himself as thin as he did? But that is what he did. And it's true that he got all kinds of advice about the kind of music he ought to be writing. When he first wrote On the Town, his conducting mentor, Serge Koussevitzky, was outraged. He said, "Why are you writing that? What did he say? It's, he called it like gutter music or something." He had a really low opinion of popular music and jazz. He was really old world, old school, and he was very snobby, which my father was not. So after On the Town opened, apparently, Maestro Koussevitzky said to my dad, "Is a jazz, but is a noble jazz." That was about as nice as he could be about it. And the other aspect of composing that my father was urged to hew to was to simply write 12-tone music, like everybody else was supposed to do exclusively in the mid-20th century. And I just marvel now, looking back at it, that everybody got into such a straitjacket about this 12-tone thing. It's just astonishing to me now, because now that everyone has gotten over themselves, and composers, don't you all feel free to write in any idiom that occurs to you and to mix them up together, even in one piece? Nobody cares, right? Nobody's gonna put an X in the margin and say, you can't do that because you were doing this on page 3. Nobody cares, right? Which is great. But it was my father's misfortune, I guess, to be coming up in the mid-20th century, and not only was he not supposed to compose anything but 12-tone music, he was also advocating for all those 12-tone pieces that were coming up and being commissioned by the New York Philharmonic and that he was premiering and presenting to the world. So he started this idea of the pre-concert talk. No one had ever done that before. Now everybody does it, but back then it was kind of a new thing. And he would come out and talk about these 12-tone pieces that were being premiered and would just twist himself into a pretzel of explanation, trying to find some way to make the piece have some connection with you know, that very recalcitrant subscription audience that are all sitting there like, what is this weird music? We don't get it. So he was trying to give them some kind of context or toehold or something. And, you know, good for him for giving it the old college try.
You know,
and maybe it helped, I don't know.
well, speaking about the recalcitrant New York subscription audience, there's a reason I'm asked about as your father brought Aaron Copland into that fold, and Aaron Copland had brought him to the New York Philharmonic as one of the people. I'm sure that Mr. Kusevitsky had something to say too, but as I understand it, Mr. Copland helped get your father into the position of assistant conductor. And then later, of course, your father brought Aaron Copland's music to the subscription series, which was say, hey, everybody, and that's how the wall started to actually break down between the class, you know, jazz and legit. But I was covering for Kurt Masur at the Philharmonic, and I brought a date, and the first half was, I think it might have been Tan Dun, but it was something that was a huge concerto for percussion and all kinds of crazy stuff that the Philharmonic audience even then was less used to than many others. And that was the first half. The second half was the New World Symphony. And my date went into the ladies' room at the intermission, and she heard all of these very elegantly dressed ladies. Can you believe that they would program that at the New York Philharmonic? I just can't believe it. And so at the mirror, while everybody's watching, and so my date says to these lovely ladies, she says, so you really didn't like, oh no, I just found it appalling. And she said, well, that's good to know. My husband is the composer, and I'll pass that along to him. But I've always wanted to ask if it's, my impression was true, which was that one of the people that your father brought to the Philharmonic and the subscription series was Aaron Copland, and really kind of solidifying his position as the dean of American composers, and therefore the one who kind of helped, along with your father and Samuel Barber and a few others, to make it so recognizable when a classical work sounds American. Is that?
I think he had a lot to do with it, sure. And mind you, in a footnote, it should be said that Aaron Copland went off into 12-tone land himself and abandoned tonality in his later works, and a lot of those works were presented at the New York Philharmonic by my dad. Connotations and Inscape and all those really gnarly, difficult later works of Copland's. It always reminds me of how was it in the early 70s? Yeah, early to mid 70s, when disco arrived, and all these, you know, sort of rock stars that we had been following for years went over to disco.
Oh, yes.
And it was like a thing, you know, uh-oh, they've gone disco. And so it was like Aaron Copland went disco. But anyway, I mean, I think it's true that, you know, there was this American sound in symphonic music, which certainly got its start with Gershwin, and had Gershwin not died so young, I think he would have taken us a lot further along with that. And then Copland, he dabbled in the jazz idiom for a little while. Who was it who said it was his one wild oat? Did you ever hear that?
About Copland? No.
Yeah, Copland and jazz.
Yeah.
Jazz was his one wild oat, which I think is so cute. And it's so Aaron, because Aaron, he was such a pure guy in a way. He was just what he was. But he was very left-wing and very much a part of this populist movement, leftist movement in the late 30s, early 40s called the Popular Front. And so he developed his own way of composing music that would be very user-friendly for the regular person,
The masses.
the working man, the masses. And that's why he developed that idiom that we all think of as, this is American music, Appalachian Spring and Billy the Kid and all those wonderful pieces of Aaron's. But it was just one way of composing for him among many. And the same was true of my dad, that he had many different ways of composing. But in the halls of academe, that was really frowned upon. By the time it was the mid-20th century, that was not cool anymore.
Right.
And actually Copland's standing was lowered in those academic environments, and he was no longer considered on the cutting edge. They were looking at,
Well, as
I
was
don't
your
know, Walter
dad's.
Piston and Pierre Boulez and
As was your dad's. I mean, it was.
he was totally out.
As students in the 70s, we didn't study your dad's
Of
music.
course you didn't.
You would not have been told to do so.
His
That was
music was
not-
musica non grata.
Yeah, not in the center. A question, later in your dad's life, for the last 25 years or so, he really ended up conducting more than composing. I think that's fair to say, that there was a slowing down, or that he moved more into conducting. What do you think? What was the reason? Did he and I think, by the way, less interest in popular music, as far as I can tell. What do you think?
Where are you counting from?
Now, let's say, so I dedicated he died in 1990, right? So let's say from 80 to 90, the last 10 years of his life, certainly,
Okay.
I think his output slowed down, you can tell me
yeah,
I'm mistaken,
it
I
did.
think I'm
Well,
correct.
he wrote that gigantic opera, A Quiet Place.
Yes.
And that opera has a lot of 12-tone in it, but it isn't exclusively 12-tone at all. But it has its own very idiosyncratic voice. It doesn't exactly have popular music in it, but that's not true. It does have it has a number that's sort of like a strip blues number that one of the characters sings, and so there are these different elements that show up just as they do in most of my father's work. And it was very ambivalently received, this big opera. And I think that really hurt my dad. And so the thing is, composing was very hard for him.
Yeah.
And as he got older, it was harder to find the notes. I think a lot of composers have that happen to them as they get older. It's harder to find new and individual notes. And the other thing was that because these later pieces of my dad were not met with enthusiasm, I think it was very discouraging, whereas every time he conducted the Vienna Philharmonic, the sky fell in with the joy and adulation. So you can't blame the guy for doing the thing that people seemed to respond to.
That's a
I
good point.
have to say,
It was healing.
Yeah.
I met him when he came to Indiana to compose A Quiet Place. And the reason he went there was because he could write something at midnight, and by noon the next day he'd have 6 fresh-faced young future superstar opera singers. They'd have printed out, and he could get that instant feedback. And what was interesting to me about that particular piece, apart from the fact that it was a sequel to Trouble in Tahiti, which, by the way, always closing here. That's coming up. Actually, tickets are almost gone, so I'm not sure that.
Oh, no.
we're-
Get them quick, really.
Yes,
Don't
there's
miss
a
it.
few. It's a really exceptional piece. He used 12-tone when he was talking about the challenges of this dysfunctional family, that the 30 years had gone by, and the destructive elements were still there, and the people still weren't talking to each other, and gradually they were coming together. And then as they came together, which I always thought was the prelude to Act 3, where this absolutely gorgeous melody and these chords that were very distinctly tonal. He used tonality to bring the sense that, well, there is still hope for this family to reconcile.
It's a great piece. And you know where else he did something similar was in Mass, which is also going to be here in Tucson very soon, and I hope you don't miss that one either. It's an amazing piece. And I think of all my father's pieces, it's his most personal
The Mass?
expression. Yep. it has so much of him in it. It's a kind of self-portrait, actually. And in that one, it actually uses the liturgy of the regular Catholic Mass as the spine of this theatrical work. And, but then, so anyway, the Mass liturgy is always sung by the chorus, who are in robes and are, you know, very formal, and they always sing in 12-tone. But then there's this street chorus, and they're all dressed like we all are, you know, and just in jeans and stuff, and they're the ones who are always asking the priest, the celebrant. They have all these questions, you know, the questions that my father was asking in almost every piece he wrote, you know, if you're up there looking after us, why is everything such a mess down here? And why are we all so horrible to each other? And why is there war? And why is there hatred? And why? It's why? So that's what the street chorus is demanding to know. And so you have this juxtaposition between the very prayerful, formal 12-tone chorus and then the informal, rowdy, fist-shaking street chorus.
Let me ask you, as a prelude, let me just mention something. So we talk politics very tangentially. So we're in the week of the S-hole, you'll excuse me. So
S-house, I thought it was.
S-house, that's it. So in a performance of the Serenade by Glenn Dictorow, who was for many, many years the concertmaster of the New York Philharmonic, Mr. Bernstein was conducting the piece. And he turned to Glenn, this is the quote at least that I have quoted here. He says, "This is the best effing piece I ever wrote."
That sounds about
Now,
right.
was that just because he was conducting that piece that day? Did he love that piece? Do you remember anything about this? What about the Jeremiah Symphony? Did he ever go back to early pieces and say, wow, I really love those pieces also?
Well, you know, people would ask him, what's your
By
favorite
the way,
piece?
musicians talk like this, so it's okay. Presidents probably shouldn't, but musicians, that's how we
Yeah,
tend
that's
to
right.
talk.
You know, he was often asked, what is your favorite of your pieces? And he would say, oh, I can't pick a favorite, they're all my children, you know, that old line. But honestly, whichever one was in front of him was the one he loved the best, because he was absorbed in it and rediscovering it. So
Yeah.
if he had Serenade in front of him, then
He
that's
liked
the
that
one he
the
loved.
best
But
then.
you know what? It is his best effing piece. He was right.
It's a
Go
funny.
listen
I
to the
think it-
Serenade.
I think it's his best orchestral. It's like a little jewel.
Gem.
Yeah.
Although, of course, I've just been immersed in the Symphony No. 3 Kaddish, so now I think that's the best one.
Yeah, well, that's true. And we talk about that a lot. It's a piece of music, you study for it as a conductor, you study for X number of weeks or months, depending on how many times you've done the piece already.
Which one are you talking about now?
Well, any piece.
Oh.
And then then it comes, and the first rehearsal, it's like your old friend comes and visits you. It comes in, and you rehearse it, and then you perform it, and then that friend, who you knew from years ago the last time you played the piece, is here for a week and then gone. And it's kind of it's a nice cyclic relationship that you have with these pieces. And it's absolutely true. You fall in love with the one you're with. To quote, was it Stephen Stills?
Yeah.
Stephen
Yeah.
Stills.
Love the one.
Sorry
you're
about that.
That's Stephen
So
Stills.
I-
They don't know that either.
And
You
by
just
some
did.
crazy
God.
coincidence,
Great song.
I did the Serenade with Glenn Dictorow.
You did.
Yes, I did it in Colombia, as a matter of fact,
Cool.
and had just a marvelous time. And we talked a lot about that. We were driven. We were not allowed to walk the streets.
Right.
It was a few years ago, and we'd be driving, and he'd be talking about how your father conducted it and what we did, and that's another way to learn from the master through another master. It was a
Sure.
marvelous
Wow.
experience. Yeah.
Sure.
And he sure could play that violin, Glenn
Oh,
Dictorow.
yeah.
He
Yeah,
played the
fabulous.
Serenade like nobody else.
Matt has a.
I have so
Yeah.
many things I want to ask you, but I have to. Maybe I'll save some of it for later for
Okay.
the second thing. I want to ask about. We talked a bit about 12-tone music. I'm curious about electronic music, another side of the avant-garde, and your father's responses to that music. Because one of the things that I've been studying lately was one of his young people's concerts on J.S. Bach, and he sort of dismisses some of the newfangled electronic music. This is in, I think, 1966 or 67. But he embraces rock music, and he talks about that new stuff re-energizing classical music. And it's really interesting to me because there's always this, when I think about your father's music and his conducting, I think about the push and pull between doing new stuff and embracing what already exists and has been successful. So I'm curious if about both electronic music and rock music, and what kinds of reactions he had. I'm thinking mainly in the 1960s, but if there are any other recollections you have about his responses to some of those newer trends.
Yeah, I may not be so helpful for this question because I can't remember exactly what my dad said about electronic music. I mean, there it was, and I'm sure that I know that he programmed some of it. And I remember our all marveling at the Moog synthesizer.
Right.
And he used a Moog synthesizer and a smaller version of it possibly in Mass.
I would think so.
And so he knew about them, but the thing about my dad was that he was so terrible with machines of any kind that he was himself incapable of comprehending or operating anything that was either, mechanically sophisticated or forget electronics. And he never had an audio system he didn't break. Just because he had, he was such a beautiful, elegant pianist and conductor, and he was really a good athlete. He was a really good skier, and he played great tennis, but he just had this way of lurching around in space and knocking things over, and, he'd grab the tone arm and go, and the record would be ruined, and then he'd sort of lunge at something, and it would come off in his hand. So, like, when it came to electronic instruments, forget it. And I remember late in his life, someone tried to set up a synthesizer for him to use to compose on, and it had just been invented. The programming was very rudimentary, and the thing that he couldn't barely operate it, but the few times that he did, it inserted the bars in all the wrong places because it didn't understand how to do that yet very well. It was a baby synthesizer, and so he just said, forget this.
Well, he can play the piano pretty well. He could sit down at the piano
he went back
and
to
do
the
stuff.
piano and composed on the damn piano like he always
And what about popular music in the 60s and
Pardon
then
my
thereafter?
back.
Oh, no,
George, I feel
Yeah,
bad.
George, come around a little bit
Yeah.
so that we can,
That's
There
better.
we go.
I
There we
feel
go.
bad turning
Yeah.
my shoulder to you.
and his relationship to popular music in the 60s and then early 70s from the Mass, and then did he remain interested or did he become a little bit less interested after his
He
initial
became less
attempt?
interested, and it was such a lucky piece of timing that the Beatles and everything that came with them came along just as I was a preteen, like 11.
Right.
So I was, of course, a complete Beatle maniac. And it was so wonderful that my dad loved the Beatles too. And I think I learned more about music from sitting next to him on the couch with the Beatles on his stereo and the cover in our laps so we could read the lyrics, and then he would talk about, I learned all these things about, so many things about music, just so many things, through the Beatles. And it was a beautiful experience for both of us. And I think that once I got older, he didn't feel quite as compelled to keep up with it all.
Right.
And because I remember playing him the Pretenders' Brass in Pocket, which I was crazy about. And this was already maybe I was already out of college. I can't remember what year Brass in Pocket was. It was later.
And he was less excited by that.
I couldn't get him to focus on Brass in Pocket. I thought, well, don't you get how cool it is? And then seeing how it sounds like they've gone somewhere else, but it's actually the one. And I was trying to, he just wasn't interested.
One more. Let me just. Just while we're in the late '60s. Do you remember anything about the performance? There's a seminal piece, at least for composers, by a composer named Luciano Berio, called Sinfonia. Do you remember anything about that piece at 68? You might have been too young.
I was too young, and probably I was not really focused. I didn't start going to the grown-up concerts till just around then.
Around then.
So I don't think I have no memory of the Berio.
Okay, I had to ask
Sorry.
that. George.
Well, I was going to ask, because I may have told this story. My children will tell me, my sons are 15, And I may have dropped this story on their friends a few times. And they roll their eyes each time. But summer of 1982, and I had only known your father for a few months, and we were backstage at it was a concert. No, I'm sorry, it was 86. Goodness. And we were backstage. Michael Stern was there, and he and I were working with your father.
Isaac Stern's son.
Yeah, and
Conductor.
yeah, he conducted here in December, interestingly enough. And he reminded me of this story when we had breakfast. We were both in your father's dressing room at intermission. He was touring with somebody. He was doing a concert at UCLA, and we were in his dressing room at intermission. Several people, I think Harry Kraut was there, and there's a knock on the door, and these two big burly guys, 6'4", 280, each of them, said, "Mr. Bernstein, Michael Jackson's here, and he'd like to meet you." And your father said, "Oh, great! I love Michael." And they said, "Well, actually, he'd like you. He's got a room down. He'd like you to go to his room." And he was. You could see that he was annoyed, but he still smiled. And he grabbed a coat. For some reason, there was like some coat or sport coat in the closet, and he said, "Throw this over his head and bring him down. Nobody will mob him, you know." He was afraid people would mob him. So he comes down, and boom, 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 he walks in, and your father just said, "Oh, Michael, I can't believe this is the first time I've had a chance to embrace you. I was absolutely enthralled by the Thriller album." So he was still connecting with real popular music, and the one thing that there was always this understanding that he connected with sincere emotional expression in music, which is his way of doing it, but he also understood the slick production side of the entertainment side of the art. So, and he seemed to appreciate all of it.
Yep, he was a big Michael Jackson fan, as were we all.
Yeah.
Matt?
I'm sure we'll talk about Mahler a little more later too, but I have to ask, seeing all the composers he came into contact with, what memories you might have of your father talking about Mahler's music and how much it meant to him, maybe even just from the standpoint of that conductor-composer push and pull, but anything else that you might remember.
Well, I have a book coming out in June, so you'll get to read a lot more about this subject in my book, but I will recount the very first time I ever heard any Mahler music. Mm-hmm. It was when I was about 9, and we had a little country house in Connecticut, and my father was studying the score of Mahler Fourth, which he was going to perform with the Philharmonic that fall. So he schlepped the sort of portable stereo record player. It was not that portable, but he dragged it all the way down the steps, halfway down the hill where the swimming pool was, and plugged it in and put the record on, and then sat on the deck chair in the sun with the score in his lap while my brother and I were splashing around in the swimming pool. So as the record played, we got this sort of play-by-play description of what was going on from our dad, and he was saying, "See, you hear the sleigh bells, and here they come again." And so it's very, very kid-friendly, Mahler Fourth, in a lot of ways, and so that was a great way to be introduced to the piece. And then, of course, the last movement of Mahler Fourth is, which features a singer. The text is all a child's vision of heaven. So our father is explaining all this to Alexander and me. And so when I look back and think about this summer day, that's sort of my own childhood heaven,
That's great.
Well, what do you think about seeing if people have some questions for you?
Sure.
Question time. Question time. First the student, and then Neil, go ahead.
Just while we're talking about Mahler, it's very interesting to look at your father's annotations of the Mahler scores.
Did you find them on the New York
Yeah,
Philharmonic
they're all
website?
online. Yeah.
Isn't that the best website ever?
It's amazing.
Oh, what an archive.
For the Mahler seminar that we had last semester, I actually went through all of the sixth and just looked at all of his annotations, and it's crazy in depth. So Maestro, I'm wondering, is that a commonplace thing, or is that something that Mr. Bernstein was very adamant about making all those annotations, and
Yeah.
might that have played into maybe one of the reasons
Well, when I
Choosing the score rather than remember?
when I was your age, I actually went into the library and opened the scores. I did, because I had the great chance to work with Kurt Masur, and between rehearsals, I would go up there and I would go in and I'd say, okay, well, my next big project is Brahms' Second Symphony, and I would go, okay, well, I've got, it might be Mr. Metas, it might be Bruno Walters, and then of course it was Leonard Bernstein, and I would always go, and I would then go and make notes in my score, and I'd say LB. If you go through my scores, you'll see all kinds of notes. If you go to a Schumann symphony, the detail where he doesn't do any reorchestrating. He doesn't change any notes. All he does is change dynamics, because that's Gustav Mahler actually rewrote them in their entirety. But yes, a couple of the Mahler scores were part of the things that I got a chance to work with. I don't think that would be why he chose to use his score more later in his life. But it was very clear, and it taught us how the process of learning a piece and how you get familiar with it, and then you start to analyze it, and the act of writing these things is part of what cements it in your head, and that's what made that way of learning, taking from other conductors and figuring out then, if you've got six, it'd be easy to have 6 versions of a Luftpause, and you could, how do people do it, and then you decide on your own, and that's how you become a conductor, I guess.
It's an interesting point about his having the score in front of him as opposed to memory. Sometimes he conducted without the score, actually. But I think he liked having the score there. Maybe it was just like a security blanket. A lot of times he would be conducting without looking down, and then you'd see him flipping pages,
Right.
you know, like this to find where they were finally up to.
Exactly.
So that
That's how I used to get in trouble with that, which is when I started really just saying, well, all I really need to do is 3 or 4 little things, because everything else is all there. And if I'm enjoying even like a pop soloist, and all of a sudden I realize, well, yeah, I know the song, but how did they write the ritardando in the orchestra version, you know? And then I have to do that.
Yeah, that happens.
Pat.
Okay, I'd like to go back to your childhood. People, when you're a kid, you accept what your father does regardless, you know, and it just seems normal. At some point, you must have realized that what he did wasn't normal to other kids and what their dads did, and that he was really famous. When did that happen, and how did you react when you suddenly realized your dad was?
Okay, well, I have 2 answers for you. One is something that my brother and sister and I have sort of cooked up. It's not 100% true. But what we say is that it was the night we were watching the Flintstones, and Betty and Wilma are going to the Holly Rock Bowl to hear Leonard Bernstein conduct. And we thought, oh, wow, well, if Leonard Bernstein is in the Flintstones, he must have really hit the big time. And we actually call each other, Nina Bernstein, you didn't answer my email. Right. And then the other thing is that when I was in 2nd grade, so I'm only 7 years old, my classmate, Lisa, teased me by calling me Famous Father Girl.
Oh, my.
And that is the title of my book.
Wow.
It's a little snarky, you know. I just kind of love it.
Go ahead, Mr. Axtell.
I want to ask about his role as the television persona, both in the young people's concerts and later in the Norton lectures. How was your father perceived as a teacher? Was he as great as I seem to remember him?
Yeah, I think
Yeah.
you remember accurately. And you know, I think I said this last night at the pre-concert talk, that so many backsides in those seats are in those seats because they watched the young people's concerts on television. And that was the point of entry for this world of music for so many people of all ages, not just the kids, but also their parents. You know, may never have known anything about classical music until they watched the young people's concerts on television. And back then, it was such a different world. There were only 3 networks, and every household, average household, had 1 screen. That television in the living room, the big clunky console that was in black and white, that was the screen. So when I talk to young people, I like to say, I tell them this, and I say, well, how many screens do you have in your house? Go ahead, start adding them up. And you have to count all the phones. Go ahead, do it. You have all the phones, all the laptops, and maybe you have that little screen when you back up in your car, right? And have you run out of fingers yet? Right? In my house, it's 12. And which is a perfect expression of how pixelated everything is now. If Leonard Bernstein came along now and did young people's concerts on TV, it wouldn't reach but a handful of people because entire families don't sit down in front of their 1 screen together. That just hardly ever happens anymore. But back then, you could affect an entire family and reach out to all those different generations, you know, the grandparents and the parents and the kids, and they're all watching Leonard Bernstein and the New York Philharmonic and liking the music and understanding what he's saying and getting all, you know, intrigued, and then coming back for the next one.
Not only was your dad's time good, his timing was great to have come along when he did.
Well, he and
with
television
TV
came along together. That
Yeah.
was such a
Yeah.
lucky break for
My-
both
and,
of them.
and long play records. I mean, the ability
That
to
too.
record, he was right there with both of those.
I hadn't
Immediate.
mentioned yet that
true.
my mother was pretty fond of your father.
Many mothers.
I think there was a lot of that. Oh, you get to work with Leonard Bernstein, she said. Oh my goodness.
Yeah.
Well,
It didn't hurt that he was easy on the eyes.
Yeah, right.
He was really handsome,
Yeah.
and he just had that thing on television, you know,
Absolutely.
that telegenicity.
Yeah.
One night,
And
really
charisma.
late at night, I found a Norton lecture on some cable channel, and then I was just flipping around, and I found Emeril also on another channel, you know, the
Oh.
chef. And I found myself toggling back and forth, Bernstein, Emeril, Bernstein, Emeril. And of course, they couldn't be more different, but they had the same thing, which was that you couldn't stop watching them.
Well, the
I
other
don't know
thing,
what that is.
the other thing about it was that he brought not only the young people's concerts in general, but he brought the prestige of the music director presenting the young people's concerts,
Right.
which was really remarkable. The other thing you'll notice is those audiences, those kids are perfectly dressed and incredibly attentive, and he was not. Oh, no? Well, on TV they seemed like it.
Yeah, on TV, well, they weren't showing all the paper airplanes sailing off the balcony.
Oh, no.
They were not perfect, but,
But-
they sure were well dressed, yes.
But the
Yeah.
best one, I just, researching for we were going to try to get some young people's things going at one of the theaters here. It didn't quite work out. But we've been pretty busy without it. But one of my favorites was he's talking about how exciting Stravinsky's Firebird is, and the Koshchei's dance, and bum bum bum, and he's talking about, and he said, and now we're going to play Koshchei's dance from Stravinsky's Firebird, and here to conduct the orchestra is Igor Stravinsky.
Boy, oy, 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 oy.
And today you go, and it's a concert for kids. It was really
Amazing.
remarkable. Yeah.
Yeah, he brought out Aaron Copland, too,
Yeah.
Well, that was before jet setting became the norm.
I guess.
Right.
Well, then they all
Yeah.
happened to be in New York. I
Yeah,
guess.
yeah.
That helped.
Sir.
Yes, I'd like to ask about his relationship to a couple of other composers. Number one being Jewish, and a lot of Jewish people have trouble with Wagner. How was his relationship to Wagner's music? And back to the American side, William Schumann and Charles Ives.
Oh, okay. All right, well, we'll start with the really bad one, and then we'll get better, right? So, well, Richard Wagner, I think we can all agree, was one of the world's worst human beings ever. I did a educational concert where I was comparing Wagner and Brahms because they were at the same time, as many of you obviously know, and were in different camps. So this made for a very fun discussion to have. And so I was, reading up on Richard Wagner, and I didn't know that much about him, and when I read about all the horrible stuff he did in his life, I was appalled. to say nothing of his rampant anti-Semitism. He's a terrible man, and he wrote unbelievable music. So my dad wrestled with this every bit as much as all the rest of us do. And he thought that, Wagner was utterly reprehensible, but he made an incredible recording of Tristan und Isolde. He never did the Ring Cycle, but he did Tristan, and certainly did a bunch of other stuff, and the Liebestod many times, and really admired the music. But he wrestled with the whole thing. He really wrestled with it. And I think he even, maybe it was never finished, but he was making a video documentary about Wagner and this very difficulty. But I think maybe he never finished it in his lifetime. So that's Wagner. Then we were going to talk about
William Schumann.
Bill Schumann, who was a friend of
yeah.
the family and a really wonderful guy who wrote wonderful music, and my dad loved him and performed his music, programmed it all the time. And so that's all a very happy story, and Bill could not have been a more wonderful person. Yeah. And then Charles Ives was just, he's like a weirdo outlier superstar. And my dad knew it. And he actually performed Ives' Second Symphony for the first time that the composer ever heard it. You know this story?
1954, I think.
Yeah.
is
So
the
Charles
year.
Ives was really old by then. He was in his 80s, and he was
Yeah.
living in Connecticut. And his neighbor came over and said, Leonard Bernstein and New York Philharmonic are performing your Second Symphony tonight, and it's going to be on the radio. Oh, I don't want to listen to that. He was a real grumpy curmudgeon, but they insisted. And they got him to come over to the neighbor's house, and they sat in front of the radio, and he heard his symphony for the first time. And of course, it sounded great, because it is great. It's a great symphony. And afterwards, the story goes that Charles Ives was so elated that he went home and cut off his beard.
Wow.
That's the story.
There you have it.
Just to follow up on that, because I was put in the strangest place as a nice Lutheran boy from Minnesota. I was put on the stage at the Tucson International Jewish Film Festival, which we took part in on Saturday. And it was it was a documentary about this young, well, he's not young anymore, but as a young man, he was Jewish, but he fell in love with the music of Wagner, and he was trying to decide if he should go to Bayreuth to experience it. And so the film is, he goes to Holocaust survivors, he goes to composers, he goes to and he finally concludes that, well, yes, he can morally justify going. And there was a panel discussion after this movie where I was supposed to take one side, and the head of Judaic Studies program was the other guy. And of course, quite honestly, the panel generally said, well, no, the guy shouldn't have gone to Bayreuth. And they all kind of looked at me and said, well, what are you going to say? And I said, well, all I know is that, and I would sometimes use these terms, my mentor, Leonard Bernstein, said that the greatest piece in the world ever written was Tristan and Isolde. Now, he may have said it about some other pieces as well. And I said, that's my only, it's not a defense, it's just, it's great music. And the one more thing, I did that talk, and some people came to me and they said, you should have been more assertive. You should have been, you shouldn't have been afraid to say what you really think. And one of the women came to me and said, when I was 16 in 1967, I was living in Tel Aviv as a young Israeli. And we were at a party one night, and some of my teenage friends said, come over to this guy's house, got something. And it was a recording of Richard Wagner. And it was so taboo.
Samizdat, right?
It was just, that was really, so that's a very, very difficult, challenging relationship.
Yeah. It's a really thorny subject, and there is no easy answer to it.
No. Other questions? Yes, John.
I have several relations to Leonard Bernstein, even though I've never met him personally. For one, George Hansen, my first conductor, was Gregor Noir. They're both mentored by your dad. Eileen Perry Prager, she was a pianist here, that Prager's daughter in the New York Philharmonic. She
here on Benny Goodman and things he commissioned, and of course there's a lot of connections with that, things. But I'm wondering, did Benny Goodman ever come to your house? And if he did, do you have any stories about him?
I wish he'd come to our house. I don't recall Benny Goodman ever coming to our house. But he sure did a fantastic recording of my dad's piece, Prelude, Fugue, and Riffs.
Right.
I don't know whether any of you know that piece. It's like a 12-minute...
We did a festival with your dad's music a few years ago, and we played that piece.
Oh, isn't it great?
So the jazz ensemble played. It's a wonderful piece. If you haven't heard it, go here.
You know,
Prelude,
Prelude, Fugue,
and Riffs.
And
it's wonderful.
here's the practicality of that. The difficulty, the reason you don't hear it more is it's expensive. You got to hire a bunch of saxophones, a couple extra trumpets, and 4 percussion. And I have actually, I tried for 20 years to get it on a program with the TSO.
do
And
it.
every time it just,
Well, it doesn't
But
fit in the
I-
natural symphonic
Right,
world.
and
I-
you know, the strings don't get to do anything.
right. And I
Right.
finally got, I crossing my fingers that somebody doesn't, some, budget person doesn't come along and say, you shouldn't have to have 2 clarinets in an orchestra. But the, I'm going to do it in August for the first time.
That's great. Where? Here?
At the Sun River Music Festival in Oregon.
It's
Oh, that's great.
wonderful.
We'll have fun with it.
Yeah, it's
Yeah.
very close to the actual birthday. So.
Wonderful.
Any other questions? Yeah, Jakub. Loudly. I should mention Jakub is expecting, he and his wife, their second child in March. So this question is very apropos.
Okay, well, I will not have anything reassuring to say to you. My brother and sister and I all had piano lessons. We all hated our piano lessons, and we had a really bad attitude, and we never practiced. And it's weird because, in some families where the parent or parents are illustrious musicians, the kids take to it like ducks to water. Think of Peter Serkin or Isaac Stern's 2 sons, David and Michael, who were both conductors. I mean, there are lots and lots of examples. And in other families, it doesn't happen. So we were in the latter category. But I will say that when I quit my piano lessons, finally, at age 16, then I started playing the piano for fun. And I also taught myself the guitar in through there. And so I actually pursued a career as a singer-songwriter for many years, quite a few years. And I actually even got a record deal. I made the record, but it wasn't released. And then by then I was married, then I started having my family, and I thought, ugh, forget it. I'm too old to go on the road anyway, which is really funny because
now you're on the
now
road.
I'm on the road all the time. But I don't make the music with my own body, which works much better.
Sir.
One of my favorite pieces is SYMPOSIUM, and it doesn't seem to be performed very often. It doesn't seem to have the popularity that other of his pieces do.
Yeah, well, as George said about Prelude, Fugue, and Riffs, the same can be said of Songfest. It's expensive to put on because it has 6 vocal soloists in front of an enormous orchestra, although there is a chamber arrangement as well. But still, it's expensive to hire 6 singers, and it is a fabulous work. It's this series, it's a song cycle, and all the texts are taken from over 300 years of American poetry. So it goes all the way back to the, Puritan poet Anne Bradstreet, and all the way forward to Lawrence Ferlinghetti and Julia de Burgos, and the poetry addresses all the issues that we think about today about sexuality and diversity, and it's all in there. So it's actually the most urgently relevant piece. And now that it's the centennial, it is getting a lot more performances. So maybe you'll get lucky and hear it somewhere.
It's one of a couple pieces that I tried very hard to get on the program this year. The Song Festival doesn't actually present the programs. We kind of persuaded people to do certain things, and because we're the Song Fest, and I happened to be, I spent 2 summers with your father in Los Angeles, 82 and 86, and I can't remember which of those he actually conducted it at Hollywood Bowl. And it was a remarkable thing to experience, but it was very difficult, technically, getting it together. And obviously very expensive when you have to hire 6 really important major voices. You can't, it's not like 2 stars and 4
Fillers,
four tag-alongs.
Yeah,
You know, it's
no.
6 big voices.
Yeah. Okay, one last question. Who's got a really great question? Sir, you want to, it better be good because it's the last and you're the only one. Here you go.
No pressure.
No pressure.
How do you grow classical music with today's young audiences?
How do you get them to be interested? That is the $640,000 question that every orchestra in the land is desperately asking themselves.
I have the answer, though. I'm going to preempt her for 1 minute, and that is you play lots of new music. They love it. But go ahead.
Well, I mean, you know, you play the Star Wars music. That's one of the recipes that gets the kids into the seats. But it's a struggle. It is a struggle for every orchestra. And one of the reasons that I'm excited about my dad's centennial is that it's this once-in-a-lifetime, unrepeatable opportunity to introduce him to young audiences, because kids today don't know who Leonard Bernstein is.
Right.
They just don't. Maybe they've heard of West Side Story, maybe they've seen the movie on video. I mean, that might be, that's about it. And even that is not a guarantee. So having, for example, here in Tucson, there are so many performances of Bernstein works that there are all these opportunities to take the kids along and get them interested. Kaddish might have been a little challenging for a kid, but...
Well, but you don't
know,
just mean kids. You mean also younger audience, which means 20 and 30-year-olds.
Absolutely.
So what I can tell you is when I was composer in residence with the Phoenix Symphony, this is simply factual, and when we played great new music, and I'm going to include any music of the 20th century, pretty much, which means Leonard Bernstein, which means William Schumann, which means Piston, which means Ligeti, which means Rands, which means Asia, which means Barrio, ticket subscriptions went up 25%. You're dealing with organizations, by and large, symphonies are very conservative institutions. Their boards of directors tend to be very conservative and nervous, and they don't understand the nature of the landscape now. But my suggestion is if there's anybody here from all of the orchestras, do Leonard Bernstein. This is not complicated. It doesn't have to be just in an anniversary year. And you do Copland, and you do William Schumann, and you do Menon, you do Hovhannes, you do Christopher Rouse. This is music that speaks directly to our experience. And then, quite frankly, in my estimation, then you move backwards to Mahler and say, yeah, this is where it comes from. Now listen to Mahler. But guess what? There was no problem on this program that was just done with Mahler and Bernstein together. Everybody got it. This is all stuff worth listening to say the least.
I was going to just add one more thing, which is I'm betting my money on this new movement of youth orchestras for social change, where youth orchestras are created in disadvantaged neighborhoods for communities that have no exposure to orchestral music. And this all began in Venezuela. You may have heard about El Sistema, and you may have heard of Gustavo Dudamel, who conducts the LA Philharmonic and came up through El Sistema. And I went down to Venezuela to see it for myself, because the idea of bringing the joy of music making to young people and combining that with making the world a better place, my father would have exploded with excitement. That's like everything he ever cared about, all wrapped into one. So I went down to see what it was, and I was so excited. And then I found out that El Sistema inspired youth orchestra programs are starting up here in the US, so I made a documentary about that, which you can see if you're curious. It's called Crescendo, The Power of Music, and it's on Netflix. But anyway, all these kids in youth orchestras, they may not all go on to be musicians. That's not the point of the program. But some of them will. And they're going to bring their entire community with them wherever they go. And, you know, there are hundreds of these programs now. So imagine, you know, just do the math. Even if, you know, 2 or 3 per program become musicians and take all their relatives and friends and families, everybody with them wherever they go, you've already added so many people, and an entire new community is going to follow their kid, their hometown kid who is now in the local professional orchestra. You're going to create massive new audiences that way. That's my prediction.
In closing, there's a wonderful article that will be out shortly in the New Criterion by a fellow named Jay Nordlinger, who's done a review of Leonard Bernstein's career. He ends with the following: Bernstein was a great musician, a total musician, and a effing genius. In his vast and varied output, he made a big contribution to the cultural heritage of this country and beyond. Thank you, Jamie, for being here. Thanks for the Song Festival. Don't forget, tonight at 7 o'clock at the JCC, you'll see us all again.